December 25th, 2001. Operation 21st, the joint UN-Japan offensive to capture the Sadogashima hive, is ongoing. UN orbital forces had bombarded Sado Island with several payloads of anti-laser warheads, blanketing the skies in heavy metal particles. With overall command given to Admiral Ozawa Hisaya, the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet and the United Nations Pacific Fleet surrounded the island, allowing ground forces to attack from Mano Bay and Ryotsu Bay. From Mano Bay, IJF troops, designated as Whiskey Unit, secured a perimeter from Takase to Sawane, holding this defense line as part of a diversionary action. Near Ryotsu, UN forces under the designation of Echo Unit had fought their way up from Lake Kamo to the tip of the island at Washizaki, where another diversionary engagement was taking place. The Beta had been led away from the hive in order to destroy these two forces, which had allowed for the 6th Orbital Drop Corps to perform an orbital dive onto Objective 21. While devastating the initial Beta found on the surface, the depths of the hive would prove more challenging to capture than anticipated. In the ensuing counterattack, the Infiltration Strike Force would be decimated, with none of the 6 escaping as the tunnels were overrun. Thousands of Beta would pour onto the surface in droves, attacking in all directions. Imperial troops suffered a near collapse, their TSF squadrons receiving heavy casualties. This was only prevented by the deployment of the Royal Guard. The IRG 16th Battalion, under Ikaruga Takatsugu, successfully held the Takase-Sawane line, while IJA troops reconsolidated their surviving units. Naval forces, meanwhile, had expended over 70% of their ammunition reserves, and fire support would soon be inadequate. The main body of Beta focused their advance upon the ridges to the island's southeast, where a UN Special Task Force had taken position. Under Captain Isumi Michiru, the Valkyries were fiercely defending a sector critical to the mission's success. With the fighting growing increasingly desperate across the island, Operation 21st hovered on the edge of failure. But over the ruins of the Nibo Dam, having ingressed from Niigata, the experimental tactical aeronautic fortress, the XG-70B Susano Mark II, moved into its final firing position. The UN Alternative 4 program's success hinged upon its performance on the battlefield, and the entire joint offensive had no other tactical options remaining. Fighting amid a massive surge of Beta, the Valkyries had eliminated as many heavy laser class as possible in order to reduce enemy anti-air capabilities. But with the Susano now in position, they were forced to break off from the fighting and clear its line of fire. With the presence of its highly classified, advanced onboard computer, the 00 unit, the aerial fortress would naturally serve as a high-value target for the Beta. The enemy herds doubled their efforts at Kamanibo, massing still in the tens of thousands and bringing forward their powerful heavy laser and fort-class strains against the Susano. As a result of the Valkyries' laser jagd, only 12 heavy laser class were confirmed to remain, out of an original cluster amounting to 100 strains. Rising heat signature readings signaled the acquisition of the Susano in their sights, and immediately, beams of laser irradiation burned against the front of the XG-70. To any other aircraft or TSF, a single shot from a heavy laser class would be sufficient to vaporize the entire machine, but the Susano remained protected by its Rutherford field. As soon as it had been struck, the laser fire dissipated against the gravity-distorting barrier. Another volley of laser fire impacted against the Susano seconds later, but this too had little effect. the Rutherford field remained stable. The heavy laser class, once having fired, entered into their 36-second refractory period, during which they were unable to emit any radiation. The Susanoo, no longer on the defensive, was cleared to begin firing its charged particle cannon in return. During this process, the 00 unit's processing capabilities accomplished the minute calculations and readjustments required between its gravity field and the main weapon. Within seconds, the Sadogashima hive was brought within its sight picture. IJF and UN forces held the line and observed as the mobile fortress made its attack. In a blinding flash, the first shot of the XG-70's particle cannon burned over the surface of Sadogashima, piercing out over the Sea of Japan and striking the hive. All Beta within a wide berth between Kamanibo and Objective 21 were vaporized in a storm of electromagnetically accelerated hydrogen atoms. The monument of the hive itself suffered intense structural damage, where few previous weapons had ever been able to damage such a structure before. When the smoke cleared, IJF and UN troops in every sector erupted in a famous and triumphant war cry. Whether from the confines of a tank, the bridges of their ships, or in the cockpit of a TSF, all who were present witnessed firsthand a successful strike back against the Beta, who had defeated them at every turn for decades. On board the Shinano, Captain Abe Tomohiko was said to have been moved to tears along with many of his staff. Like Ozawa and most of the IJN crews, he too had been present during the initial fall of Sadogashima in 1998. With a single shot, the particle cannon had exterminated the main force of Beta on the surface. The Susanoo wasted no time and began charging to fire again. The Valkyries quickly formed a defensive perimeter around it, with the escort TSFs maintaining a careful distance due to the hazardous and gravity-distorting Rutherford field. With no further enemy emerging, the Susanoo readied itself to fire, and its escorts peeled off. In another flash of light, clouds of dust and debris scattered over the island. This time, the particle cannon swept the hive monument from the surface entirely. UN and IJF troops, their spirits reinvigorated, began pushing back the remaining groups of Beta. The 999th Tactical Armor Battalion, a penal unit consisting of IJF rebels who had participated in the 12-5 incident, fought fiercely at the forefront of the Japanese line, despite their exposed positioning and usage as a vanguard unit. While damaged IJA units, such as the 133rd, withdrew, the 999th would continue to repel the Beta, fighting as staunchly as the Royal Guard Battalion. All forces fought on in hopes that the battle had finally turned. But events would prove otherwise. 10 seconds after firing its second shot, the Susanoo began listing out of control. For reasons unknown, its onboard computer had experienced a malfunction and quickly shifted into a standby mode. The aerial fortress was suddenly rendered inert, crashing into the rock face at Kamanibo. Technicians, operating remotely from the Mogami, were unable to reboot the superweapon. At the same time, the Beta, demonstrating that their most dangerous quality was in their overwhelming numbers, began surfacing yet again. A division-sized herd emerged near the central sectors of Sadogashima, while smaller packs began surfacing on every corner of the island itself. The bulk of this group moved toward Mano Bay, descending upon the beleaguered IJF line. Squadrons of Imperial TSFs suffered further losses and immediately gave ground. Ikaruga and the 16th once again attacked the enemy head-on, fighting tirelessly to maintain the Whiskey unit's position. Naval artillery support was growing increasingly sporadic, as ships running out of ammunition were forced to pull out of the battle line in order to rendezvous with vessels from the 3rd resupply fleet. The 3rd made constant trips to and from the battlefield, periodically returning with fresh rounds for the Whiskey and Echo fleets. Even with the costly amount in firepower already dedicated to the operation, the UN and IJN had not committed nearly enough ammunition to combat the staggering number of Beta reinforcements. As a result, the resupply ships were simply unable to ferry an adequate number of shells from the mainland to the fleet in a manner which would allow for the constant and liberal use of indirect fire. With the emergence of new groups of laser and heavy laser class, it grew clear that the Imperial units would be unable to hold. Armor companies and TSF squadrons, suffering well over 50% attrition rates, conducted a steady but demoralizing retreat back toward Minagawa. There, TSF carriers were already moving to retrieve armored vehicles and damaged TSFs from the battle. The IJN 4th and 17th squadrons, sustaining minor losses and having expended inordinate amounts of ammunition already, also began the process of withdrawing back into the sea. Meanwhile, at the site of the disabled XG-70, the UN Special Task Force began working on a means to salvage the sudden breakdown of their mission objective. Captain Isumi was forced to disembark from her TSF and enter the Susano in order to retrieve the 00 unit. Beta were emerging sporadically across the island, and the XG-70's experimental processing computer could not fall into the hands of the enemy under any circumstances. Evidence suggests a higher capacity for intelligence in the Beta, in spite of appearances in standard behavior. They were capable of responding to and countering human tactics in the past. As well, they have been known to develop strains specifically designed to neutralize humanity's advantages. Should either the 00 unit or the XG-70 be captured by the Beta, the possible risk of processing and repurposing either weapon for the enemy would be disastrous. Extraction and denial, then, were now the primary mission objectives. As such, Isumi attempted to activate the autopilot function of the Susano manually, while one of her surface pilots disconnected the 00 unit, relocating it onto a TSF so as to escape toward the fleet. The Valkyries were forced to divide into separate elements in order to accomplish this. Captain Isumi would remain aboard the Susano and attempt either to bring it back online or, in the worst case, overload its Morka-Collecta drive and initiate a catastrophic meltdown. 3 TSFs, Valkyries 6, 10, and 11, formed an element and would attempt to proceed across Mono Bay toward the flagship Mogami. The rest of the Valkyries, falling under 1st Lieutenant Hayase's command, proceeded to the Kokubunji ruins in order to delay the enemy and clear an escape route for the extraction element. Battlefield conditions were already aligning against the UN and Japanese forces. The Whiskey unit had fallen into disarray, with an increasing number of Beta breaking through the lines. The 23rd Armored Division was overtaken and wiped out. Only the IRG 16th and the IJA 999th battalions remained to hold the front, where the latter began sustaining heavy casualties. The Takase Sawane line was crumbling, and laser strains already lined the shore, regaining control of Mono Bay. This would ensure the certain death of any TSFs from the Valkyries trying to cross it toward the Mogami. Recognizing this, Admiral Ozawa contacted the Shinano in order to buy time for both the withdrawal of Imperial troops and the movement of the UN Special Task Force. Abe's 2nd Squadron would have to advance directly into Mano Bay in order to engage and draw fire from the laser strains along the Kawahara coastline. The 3rd Resupply Fleet, carrying fresh anti-laser shells, would take over an hour to transfer the supplies to the squadron. The 2nd Squadron, thus unable to replenish their ammo reserves in time, was forced to rely on whatever munitions they had remaining in order to conduct the attack. It was a near suicidal maneuver, but for Abe Tomohiko, this would be his finest hour. Advancing at battle speed, the battleships Shinano, Mino, Kaga, and their support vessels entered Mano Bay, firing a salvo of their remaining AOM rounds. Predictably, these shells were intercepted by laser irradiation, creating an initial layer of heavy metal clouds to cover the battleship's advance. Churning adjacent to the coastline, the battleships unleashed a barrage of close-range cannon fire. Their armored hulls were heat-resistant and had been treated with anti-laser coating, but when struck by multiple beams, the Shinano received moderate damage, and the Mino took a hit to the bow. Both remained battle-worthy. As their starboard armor absorbed powerful initial volleys of lasers, Abe ordered the vessels to starboard, turning to face their still-armored portside hulls against the enemy. Anticipating another barrage of laser fire, the vessels launched VLS countermeasures, missiles which goaded the laser strains into intercepting. These too were anti-laser munitions, and they blanketed the 2nd Squadron further in heavy metal particles, jamming all radar, but dissipating laser fire. Each battleship switched to data link targeting, raking the coastline with their cannons and light turrets. Locked in a fight at visual range, each side exchanged blow for blow as the IJN battleships engaged in a valiant display of firepower. On Sado Island, the main Valkyrie force under Hayase engaged a squadron-sized group of Beta at Kokubunji, attempting to prevent any more Beta from proceeding south to attack the detached element. Valkyries 6, 10, and 11 followed the ridges of Sadogashima toward the east end of Mano Bay. Previous Beta groups, however, still swarmed along their route in multiple directions. With hostiles converging in front of them, the 3 Shiranuis were forced to engage in hit-and-run tactics, attempting to bypass numerous grapplers and tanks standing in their way. At the Susanoo, attempts to restart the weapon had met with a brief moment of success. The XG-70 systems momentarily came online. This provoked a strange phenomenon, as several herds of Beta were reportedly seen coming to a complete halt, even while under fire. It is likely that the reactivation of the Susanoo triggered an effect which stalled the Beta into a state of decision processing, before ultimately redirecting their focus on the G-element intensive engine of the XG-70. Regardless of the many theories behind its cause, the stall was momentary, and it wasn't long before the herd oppressing Mano Bay began moving once again. Dividing in half, the bulk advanced eastward, closing in on the Valkyries. The other half pressed toward the western coast, bearing down on the evacuating IJA troops at Minagawa. Compounding matters, a brigade-sized Beta herd emerged near the vicinity of the ruined hive and began moving toward Kamanibo, threatening the Susanoo's position. As more and more Beta began moving across the island, the UN extraction force encountered a stray group of laser class. The XM-3, once again, displayed its capacity for maneuverability, allowing the pilots to evade several volleys of otherwise precise laser fire. The laser class were successfully eliminated. During the running battle, however, Valkyrie 6 suffered damage to its jump unit. Leaking propellant, the Shiranui was rendered incapable of sustaining flight across Mano Bay. The pilot, identified as Second Lieutenant Kashiwagi Haruko, then made the decision to remain on the island. Detaching from the extraction team, the lone Valkyrie retreated back to assist Captain Isumi at her position to the north. At the Takase-Sawane line, Gekishins of the 999th continued to fight a scattered resistance, with many heavily damaged or having expended all of their ammo fighting in their precarious position. Only the Takamikazuchis of the 19th remained combat capable, with their elite pilots and Ikaruga's talent for battlefield command single-handedly preventing Whiskey from being lost outright. The Royal Guard scoured the battlefield, conducting the rescue and recovery of isolated units such as the 999th, all the while fighting a skillful rearguard action as they initiated their own withdrawal. As the Beta continued to increase in number, Echo troops at Ryotsu Bay were caught in the advance of the enemy, pouring over Lake Kamo. UN troops at Washizaki sustained moderate losses, holding back the Beta advance. Carriers and landing vessels were already beginning the evacuation of their damaged units at the tip of the peninsula as well. In Mano Bay, the shootout continued between the 2nd Squadron and the laser strains along Kawaharada. As the majority of the Beta moved westward to intercept the extraction team, Abe screened their movements with his vessels, taking fire all the while. Lieutenant Hayase led the Valkyries past Old Kokubunji, where they fought and destroyed a small-scale herd. Then, her 2 flights of Shiranuis established a support-by-fire position in the desolate foothills. Scattered groups of Beta wandered their immediate vicinity, resulting in minor skirmishes. Yet for the most part, they had secured the route by which the 00 unit would be evacuated. On approach, Valkyrie 10 and 11 were attacked by yet another pack of Beta and attempted to break through. Fighting their way into the new enemy group, they would soon be dragged into a prolonged engagement, with one or both TSFs at risk of being lost. Yet nearby, the rest of their squadron, who had been waiting along the bluffs, initiated support by fire. Under the long-range fire and Hayase's dynamic leadership, the Beta were quickly neutralized. With the A-01 task force reunited, Hayase then initiated the movement of the squadron over Mano Bay, using the 2nd Squadron's vessels for cover. The IJN was still heavily engaged, having repositioned directly in the path of all incoming laser irradiation. 2 of the Shinano's main turrets took severe hits. An explosion on the bridge inflicted minor head wounds to Captain Abe. The Kaga received extensive damage to its anti-laser defenses when showered by laser fire. The Minos Bridge suffered a direct hit, erupting in flames, though its guns remained firing. All 3 battleships maintained their formation. Many of their support vessels as well had been heavily damaged or lost, despite holding formation behind the armored and laser-resistant battleships. In turn, the shoreline was littered with the bombed-out husk of Beta corpses. And yet, more laser strains continued to advance over those which had been previously dispatched. With the battleships holding the laser species in check, the Valkyries rushed across Mano Bay. Flying low over the water, they cleared the engagement before heading out to sea and vectoring northward to the Mogami. The extraction was successful, but for the 2nd Squadron, rather than withdrawing as expected, they elected to remain in the bay. Whiskey Unit was still in the process of boarding the many TSF carriers and transports which had arrived at Minagawa. Without covering fire from the battleships, the evacuation vessels would then become easy targets for the laser class. Captain Abe declined the order to withdraw, stating, "Not a single captain among us has requested a retreat." The IJN remained in the fight, continuing to exchange fire with the Beta, while Admiral Ozawa ordered the full retreat of ground forces from the island. At Minagawa, armored vehicles were ordered to be abandoned along the shore. Their crews rushed out from the hatches to climb aboard LCAC units waiting on the beach. Battered TSF squadrons established a hasty defense line, holding their position as the landing craft departed. Once this was accomplished, the TSFs began taking flight as well, heading toward the TSF carriers further out to sea. Ikaruga and the 16th remained the last group of TSFs in Whiskey, fighting against the Beta head-on. The Type 00 Takamikazuchi continued to prove its worth, allowing for the retrieval of many damaged TSFs which had fallen behind. They and members of the 999th Penal Battalion reconsolidated briefly at Minagawa before prepping for the flight out to sea. Meanwhile, UN troops in the north were evacuated in full by the carriers of Echo Fleet, both at Ryotsu and along the northern coast at Hajikazaki. After intense fighting, they retreated in good order, despite substantial damage to their own forces. By then, the heaviest concentration of Beta on the surface was advancing toward the Susanoo. A brigade-sized herd was detected at 7 kilometers and closing. Echo Fleet began firing the last of their shells in an attempt to thin out the enemy numbers. The 3rd Resupply Fleet directed their efforts toward restocking the Echo vessels. Rearming, however, served to limit the number of ships able to engage at a time, resulting in less than consistent bombardments. At Kamanibo, Lieutenant Kashiwagi readied herself to extract with Captain Isumi aboard the commander's TSF. Now piloting an undamaged machine, she remained on overwatch for the approaching enemy, while Isumi continued her attempts to restore the XG-70 from within. The two pilots intended to egress over Niigata, using whatever fuel available to maximize their distance from Sadogashima. Yet they knew full well they likely wouldn't escape the after effects of a potential detonation to the Susanoo's engines. With evacuation efforts well underway, far more Beta reinforcements began arriving. A Corps-sized herd was detected moving under the island, with thousands surfacing on Sadogashima and directly threatening the remaining 2 Valkyries. But projections indicated the rest of this herd were moving directly under the Sado Straits. Having beaten back the IJF and UN troops, a Beta counteroffensive would soon be in effect. It would only be a matter of time before they surfaced on mainland Japan, forcing the UN troops to act. The Beta, now infesting the area surrounding the Special Task Force pilots, besieged the XG-70 from multiple directions. Kashiwagi had been able to set her old TSF to function autonomously. Although functioning as additional firepower, its combat effectiveness was limited to predictive algorithms devoid of pilot input. Valkyrie 6, with limited support, moved to engage. With the fighting underway, the 2 Shiranuis put up a desperate defense, surrounded by numerous tank, destroyer, and grappler class. In spite of the elite training of the lone pilot, the sheer number of hostiles could not be contained. Attacking from the cliffs above and emerging from the earth below, little could be done to repel their assault. Before long, several destroyer class broke through, ramming into the base of the Susanoo. Isumi, who had originally intended to restart the XG-70's autopilot, no longer had the time to accomplish such a task. Now intending to disembark from the Susanoo, headquarters had determined that the naval guns of Echo Fleet would be sufficient in scuttling the weapon. Before she could evacuate, however, multiple Fort-class Beta had arrived to engage the lone defender outside. This allowed several tank class to swarm the Susanoo's hull. Overwhelmed and engaged from all directions, Lieutenant Kashiwagi's TSF was struck by the stinger of a fort class, killing her instantly. The captain was effectively cut off and left without a means to escape, forcing her to descend back into the Susanoo's interior. Rather than utilize a naval bombardment, Captain Isumi brought the engines online and initiated self-destruct procedures. As a final defensive measure, she activated and fully projected the Rutherford field, preventing any beta from making further contact with the XG-70's exterior, and entombing herself within. The out-of-control Moorcock-Lecta drive, which utilized beta resources, would naturally draw the attention of any nearby beta once powered on. As a result, the core-sized herd traveling under the Sato Straits to Japan were detected reversing course, lured in by the G elements aboard the Susanoo. The autopilot was non-functional, and any theoretical flight to be made would have proven fatal to the lone officer on board. It was now a stationary weapon of mass destruction, and with its detonation countdown set, beta all over Sadogashima single-mindedly converged upon the XG-70. At the same time, the last of the Japanese were confirmed clear of the island. The IJN 2nd Squadron, no longer under fire, was able to begin their withdrawal as well. All that remained was to await the overloading of the ML drive. Aboard the Mogami, Admiral Ozawa considered redeploying the 999th Penal Battalion on a suicide mission in order to extract the captain. As commander of a vital UN Special Task Force, her loss would be a detrimental blow to the Alternative 4 program. However, Captain Isumi elected to remain aboard the Susanoo, adamantly refusing to risk any more lives on her account. As the Valkyries landed aboard the carrier Kunisaki, the 00 unit was successfully transferred to Operations HQ. A regional alert was made to all UN and Japanese forces, and the fleets at both Echo and Whiskey began withdrawing to a safe distance out into the Sea of Japan. Captain Abe and the 2nd Squadron limped out of Mano Bay, with the Shinano, Mino, and Kaga all having survived despite extensive damage and losses among their crew. Civilians and IJF units on the mainland had been evacuated prior to Operation 21st as a precaution for the present circumstances. With the imminent meltdown of an engine reliant upon G elements, a tsunami of unprecedented scale was projected to strike the western coast of Japan. The Niigata region would be devastated, with Sato Island at the epicenter of a blast nearly inconceivable by technological standards. Yet tens of thousands of beta were already swarming the immobile machine, and even more, which would have otherwise been emerging from below at Niigata, were instead drawn to Kamanibo. Once the last of Whiskey Fleet's vessels had cleared the blast radius and taken position above the Yamato Basin, they waited. Surface pilots, sailors, and tank crews crowded the decks of their ships, watching the island in weary confusion. For many, a triumphant final effort and the success of destroying the monument and thousands of beta had quickly turned into a disastrous rout with little explanation and many losses. At 15:27 hours, the Susanoo's Moorcock-Lecta drive reached critical levels and detonated. Captain Isumi Michiru, commander of the UN Special Task Force A-01's 9th Squadron, the Valkyries, was on board, killed in setting off the explosion. To those watching on, Sadogashima was engulfed in a dark, indigo flash, an anomalous reaction caused by the detonation of G elements. Data analysis equates its blast with the force of 20 G-bombs. The island was swallowed in an explosion 40 kilometers wide, and tsunamis ravaged the coast of western Japan. Plains between the Noto and Oga peninsulas were devastated by floods, destroying many facilities along the defense lines in Niigata. Where the Sadogashima hive once stood, only the haunting expanse of the Sea of Japan remained. Many Japanese soldiers at the time believed they were witnessing yet another use of the disreputable and much-hated G-bomb. In their eyes, the hard-fought battle was a failure, one which had entailed heavy losses for no meaningful gain. The ground they'd fought to reclaim had been destroyed outright, even in victory. A glimmer of hope had simply been too much to ask. Yet Operation 21st, the goal of which had been to either capture or destroy the 21st Hive, was considered a resounding success. Out of those who had been present, Japanese casualties had been the most severe. In the days following the battle, a memorial service was held in honor of the sacrifices made. But for the UN pilots serving in the Special Task Force, their names were never cemented on a plaque and would not be known until limited details of their service were declassified much later. As well as the losses among IJF personnel, another grievous loss would be the total destruction of the UN 6 Orbital Drop Core. Due to a breakdown in communications and the complete annihilation of the Sadogashima hive, data regarding how long the 6 continued to fight and who might still have been alive for rescue would never be recovered. This marked the first time in which not a single diver would return from a drop. Quite troubling to all was the fact that projected beta numbers within the hive had been severely underestimated. Seismic waveform patterns in the future would confirm that at least one carrier class had burrowed to the vicinity of the 6th drop core, though visual confirmation remained lacking. It is also likely that additional beta from mainland Asia could have traveled to Sadogashima via the tunnels in its wake. The IJF had planned to partake in the next stages of the counteroffensive, where UN forces hoped to capture the 20th Hive at Chirawan within 2 weeks. But due to the massive expenditure in their ammunition reserves, and more importantly, in the high number of casualties among their troops, they would have to withhold large-scale participation, and instead reorganize their forces. The UN would thus primarily coordinate with the coalition of Southeast Asian nations and their troops for strategies regarding Objective 20. At Yokohama base, the Alternative 4 program measured the results of the XG-70 and the 00 unit's combat testing. The failures in the Susanoo Mark II, its near capture by the hands of the enemy, and its ultimate destruction following the loss of thousands of lives which otherwise could have been averted through proper reliance on the G-bombs, only fueled the proponents of Alternative 5 in their efforts to shut down the Fourth Plan. However, leaders in the UN 11th Force were convinced the 00 unit had indeed twice demonstrated a considerable ability to combat the Beta without need for carelessly bombarding the planet in weapons of mass destruction. As well, it had accomplished a successful reading of Objective 21, managing to obtain the layout of all hives it had been connected to, including the original hive at Kashgar. Thus, arguments among UN and US representatives only grew stronger behind the closed doors of society's upper echelons. The 11th Force still possessed the more advanced model of the XG-70, the Susanoo Mark IV, though for the most part, it still remained unassembled and under heavy maintenance. Engineers provided by Lockheed worked tirelessly alongside UN mechanics in order to refine the deficiencies noted in the late XG-70B. Technicians as well further adjusted the 00 unit, fine-tuning the device to better operate its designated weapons platform in spite of the setbacks still encountered in its development. Freed from the yoke of the Yokohama and Sadogashima hives, Japan was now confident in the belief that their territory was secure at last. By estimates, they had bought their country several years of reprieve from future beta attacks. In that time, they intended to rebuild and rearm, rotating their combat units and replenishing their ranks. Unfortunately, they would not be given the respite they so desperately needed. Both the UN and the IJF were yet again to be tested. Surviving beta from deep below the Sea of Japan had gone undetected, and they were searching for the nearest available hive reactor in order to recharge. Simple, strategic deduction would assume their movement west toward the hive at Chirawan. Yet this would prove false, and Japanese soil would soon find itself under threat once more. We will be diving further into the conflicts of 2001 in the Muv-Luv Alternative universe. Make sure to stay informed by liking, commenting, and subscribing. A huge shout out goes to the supporters on Patreon, who've been monumental in helping the channel grow. If you would like to join as part of an element, become a flight leader, or a squadron or battalion commander, the links are in the description down below. We have several custom videos being worked on at their request, so be on the lookout for more content to come.